I've opted to hold the mic because it's probably a bit better and I don't have to shout as loudly. However, I have a clicker, I have a microphone, and I can't hold my beer at the moment. So we'll see how we do that. I know this better. All right. Good evening, Bristol. Hello. Okay, still awake. Good to know. Hi, I'm Derick. I'm Europe. Yeah, I'll talk about it some other time. Currently living in London. I am PHP 7.4's release manager. That sounds really fancy, but it pretty much means just that you need to package some stuff every 2 weeks to make sure that people don't sneak in any naughty things into PHP releases that they shouldn't do. And yeah, that's how you get PHP 7.4 out and things like that. I work on Xdebug. You might have heard of that. If you haven't heard of that, please type it into Google. And maybe you know how to develop PHP a little bit better then. I also host a podcast, PHP Internals News, where I talk with people that work on PHP itself, how they add things to it. This will come back later in this talk. I like maps, I like beer, I like whiskey, and these things will come back in examples. If there's any questions, feel free to interact with me right away. There is a lot of material in here. If this takes too long time because I find myself explaining one specific thing better than others or longer than others, I might do some other bits a bit quicker than I often do because apparently I don't have 3 hours. All right, let's get going. I told you I was going to talk about some of my hobbies. I also like putting emojis in my class names. Now, I would recommend you don't do that at work. Because it's great for job security, but not good for making your coworkers happy. Anyway, probably the biggest thing in PHP 7.4 is typed properties. What are typed properties? It's basically a way of declaring your properties that they also have to be of a specific types. We already have seen this with argument types in PHP 7.0, I think, actually, and return types that came in PHP 7. But 7.4 finally extends this to properties as well. And it pretty much works as you'd expect it to work, which with PHP is not always a given, of course. So in this case, I've defined 3 properties: a public property, which is a number, an integer. There is a protected property, which is that says that the property distillery needs to be an object of the distillery class, pending no namespaces, of course. And then the last one, the private property, is the bottler needs to be of the bottler class or null. That's what the question mark means there. Now, that's pretty straightforward. It works exactly the same way as your function arguments. You can also set them on static properties if you want to do that. And you can give them default values. So in this case, I'm setting the rating 1 to 92. Must have really liked that whiskey. That's then the default value, like you would expect for any normal properties as well that you declare. And then, if you really want to, you can do multiple properties on one line, and the keywords will then apply for each of these things that are defined. That is exactly the same as PHP usually would do. The public keyword would always apply for everything on that line, and so will the bool type hint in this case. I don't think any coding standards actually allow for you declaring multiple properties on one line, but you can do it if you really want to in PHP. Now, how does this work? There will be quiz questions. What is the output of this script? Anybody wants to guess? An error. That is the correct answer. Why is this throwing an error? Well, because I have never set a value for h. And when you then access this property, it's not of any value, so it can't be of the declared property type that you have. So this says that if you try to access a property, a type hinted property that hasn't been assigned a value yet, you will get a type error. The uninitialized state is checked when you're reading this property or accessing this property for reading. Okay, next example. What does this example show you? Again, an error. That makes sense. It's an error because we're assigning a string to the distillery property, which is defined to have to be of the class distillery. So the type validation is checked when you write to a property, which is a takeaway here. Okay, next one. What is the output of this script? I hear here integer 29, which is the correct answer. Yay, applause. And why is this the case? Because we haven't told that the script is in strict type mode. The same type conversions happen as you would pass numbers to a function argument with that type. And because PHP we still do weak types here, because we haven't done anything on the top here, means that the value will be auto-converted or to the property type that it can, but only, of course, if this is possible to do. That makes sense, and you get an error message, and sorry, you don't get an error message, you just get the 29 out of there. So this type coercion when you have strict types is 0, which is currently the default. Okay, so what happens in this example, you can probably guess again. We're trying to set a string as a number with strict type mode turned on, and then in that case you'll get a type error again saying that it has to be a string. That's pretty much it. Does that make sense? Excellent. Now, the type system in PHP 7.4 got a little bit more of an overhaul, and this is sometimes a bit more complicated than you expect it to be. However, implemented in many other languages. And this is something that builds up on how can you consider an object to be the same how you can use an object in the same context as an inherited object through an inheritance in classes. So for example, we have a class that's called bread, tasty. And then there's a class baguette, which is a more specific type of bread, which is what these first two lines here say, right? So class bread, and then the baguette extends the bread. Now, a bakery, as most of you know, will produce bread. So if we call the gimme method on a bakery, we have typed this return type as being bread. Now, what you can now do in PHP 7.4 is that you can change this return type to something that is the same type of something that is more specific. Because that means that anything that calls the gimme method on this object would always be able to know how to deal with the data that comes back because it's of the same type or a more specific type. What you can't do is return a wider type, because then the original calling class not necessarily knows how to deal with that wider class. This is called covariant return types. In PHP 7.3 and earlier, this could only ever be the same type. Or I guess there's an example for not having a type defined on it. That is also supported. But 7.4 extends this to allowing for covariant return types, which is great. Now, as you can probably guess, if you do this wrong, you get type errors. So you get fatal errors saying that the declarations aren't valid. And this is something that happens when PHP is parsing the script, not when it is executing the script, or this specific file in this case. Now, the opposite happens for function arguments. If you have an inherited class, you can choose in that class to accept a wider range of data that method then can handle. So in this case, if we have a pig, which is a little animal that walks around, and a boar is a type of pig, it's a more specific kind, which means that if asterisks hunt boars, you extend that to all the goals, they will still be able to hunt the boars, but you can say, well, the whole group can also hunt a wider group of animals, because this new method that you just have overridden, you can then choose to also handle a wider type that is coming in. So these are the contra-variant arguments type. This is used in function arguments, and it again makes sure that wherever you could use an original class, you can now use a more specific class in the same context as you otherwise could do this. This whole thing is called the Liskov substitution principle that you might have heard of in some computer sciencey things. I can hardly pronounce the words, so. Of course, if you do this wrong, then you'll get your type error again. Now, there's of course a third class, which has just been introduced in PHP 7.4, which is your property types. And these are invariant property types. You cannot make the type wider, or you can make it more restricted, because a property you can always read and write, and if you change anything with the typing in it, then a class that originally would be able to read and write this property type would not be able to how to deal with something either more specific, because a class, for example, in this case, might already write planet, and you couldn't do it the other way around. So the property types that are new in 7.4 are invariant. Which means, again, if you give it a different type, then you will get an error message. Again, you get a fatal error because this gets checked when the script gets parsed. All right, so that's probably the biggest thing in PHP 7.4, and there's a whole bunch of smaller things that you might also find interesting. So a bit of a missed opportunity when the null coalescing operator was introduced, that there was no variant for assignment, right? If you have like the power or the multiplication operation, then you can use multiplication equals to change the value in angle. In PHP 7.3 or 2, I can't remember which version it was introduced in, we introduced this question mark operator that basically says, if we assign to this complex structure, variable, the value of this data comma's user ID, but if it is not set or null, we return this as a default value. But if this is really complicated, you still have to repeat that again, where you didn't have to do with angle here because we have this multiplication assignment operator. PHP 7.4 creates the null coalesce assignment operator, which is basically these two things combined by, instead of using question mark, you move to question mark here, so that you don't have to repeat this data commons user ID. Yeah, and this should have been important, should have been added at the same time as this question mark was introduced. We are, however, starting to run out of characters to use for operators, so anything else will likely be have to done by methods or functions. This is one of my also slightly missed additions to early PHP versions. I believe, again, PHP 7.2 added the ... operator, also sometimes called the splash operator, as a way how you can collect multiple variables or multiple arguments sent to a functional method into an array. So you could do foo ... variable name, and how many arguments you pass into the function foo would then be returned into an array which was named with a variable after ... PHP 7.4 adds that same sort of operator in inline array literals. So say we have an array here that is apples, it's a red apple and a green apple, and then we say fruits. So we have a pear, a peach, the red apple and the green apple, because this gets expanded in line, a strawberry and a tomato. And when you then call fruit salad and upload on all of them, you'll see that the output is all the fruits in a row. So this doesn't only work for simple arrays, it will also work for iterators and generators. In the same way, you get then introduced into this array. Can be sort of handy. It sometimes saves you to have to call array push and array push, for example, because you can just define the array. It's kind of a nice little addition. PHP 7.4 got a little bit more shouty when you do silly things, like accessing indexes of something that isn't a string or an array. So in PHP 7.3 and early, you get no warnings on this example, which is kind of annoying. In 7.4, you'll get a whole bunch of warnings here. It'll tell you the first one, because var is false, it says the first one subscript is like, you're trying to array an array offset on a value of type bool, which is this type. Now the return of doing that is null. So the next 4 warnings you get are for the 2, the 3, the 4, and the 5. PHP 8 will likely extend this to fatal errors. So you're going to have to be more careful with how you do these kind of things. Many of the warnings that have been introduced in PHP 7.4 have been introduced in such a way that it will turn into actual errors in PHP 8. So this is your wake-up call that you better start fixing these over the next year, because PHP 8 is, of course, well, I say of course, let's say hopefully landing by the end of this year. It does that for all the other data types that you expect it to do as well. Okay, another big thing in PHP 7.4 is FFI. That stands for Foreign Function Interfaces. And this is experimental, so hence my warnings that there could be dragons lurking around the corner. What FFI is, it is a way of, from PHP, directly talk to libraries written in C. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know C, but you know that C's memory model is a lot different than PHP, because in PHP you basically don't have to care. Whereas in C, if you mess these things up, it will crash. And that is, of course, never a good idea. FFI tries to make this easier, but it also makes it a lot easier to mess things up and crash PHP. So although this is sort of sometimes touted as, oh, you can now write extensions in PHP, only if you really know how to deal with C. That is one of my issues with it. So this is bundled with PHP 7.4, but it's not enabled by default, and I'm happy for that. Please consider this experimental. There's quite a few issues with it. Some of them have been fixed, others haven't been or can't be, because it is providing this interface from PHP to C, and the memory managements are different, so you can't necessarily check these things. Also, there is no documentation, which is kind of sad. There are 3 tests or something like that, so there we go. So use at your own peril, but it can be useful in some cases. So I have a very boring small example. I have written myself a library in C that calculates the position of the sun in the sky. Why? I don't quite remember, but I like messing around with algorithms, which is called sunpos. Again, not particularly well named. But how functions in C works, just like in PHP, you cannot return more than one value from a function. And the way how you do that in C is by specifying by reference arguments. PHP has a similar thing with the ampersand operator. It's not the same thing, but it's similar enough that logically it sort of makes sense. Basically, this is the in argument, and the other 5 are out arguments. That's what you'd expect to come out of the function with useful values. So what goes in is the number of days since midday January 0th, 2000. Don't ask me why it is that number. Apparently this is what astronomers use. And then what gets out is some things that I don't actually remember, because it's a long time ago since I wrote this algorithm. What I do remember is that either this one or this one is the height above the horizon, and this is the position like where on the horizon that happens. And these numbers I honestly can't remember. Sorry. But that's not what this is about. In any case, in order to use this, we need to convert the current time to this number that I've just mentioned, and you do that like this. Apparently, I don't know. Apparently, this is the time, the Unix timestamp January 0th or something like that. But the tricky bit is, how do I get the information out of this? Because you can't use PHP references when things happen with C. And when you call this method or this function in C, C expects this to be a reference to something in memory that you have allocated yourself. And there's no such concept in PHP. So hence, there's a hack around it that you have to PHP FFI new, and then you also have to specify the type. And this type, the double type, needs to be the same as you specified there. If you mess it up, it will crash, or you get very strange results. Finally, when we call the method, we pass in our number, and then instead of just passing this variable thing through it, we need to say the address of, and that's what you do with FFI : adder, and then you pass in the variable that we have executed. And then you get a number back, which then tells you, well, it doesn't tell you anything because it returns nothing, it returns void. But you get 5 bits of information back. That's what this function does. Now, this is a very simple function, a very simple API because there's only one function in it. This gets a lot more complicated if you have a library in C that is actually doing something useful instead of my little experiments here. FFI. Now, I'll go back to FFI in a moment. Something else that has also been touted as a great new feature in PHP 7.4 is opcache preloading. Now, I'll explain you a little bit what it actually does. Hopefully, when you run PHP in production, you have the opcache extension turned on. The opcache extension makes sure that PHP doesn't spend a lot of time reading figuring out what exactly happens in every script. When PHP reads a script, it just reads through it. It converts it first into like a tree structure. And from this tree structure, it converts it into like an internal structure, which we call operates, that basically is a list of instructions for PHP's virtual engine to execute in order, and then there's like little jumps. Now, that step, all these three steps, when you have opcache turned on, are cached in memory for you. So PHP doesn't have to spend the time on that, and that is an enormous performance benefit. The opcache extension will also try to optimize some of your code, and that gives it another 20-30% performance boost. Please, in production environment, turn on opcache. It doesn't take you any maintenance, and it makes PHP run 2 to 4 times as fast for free. It's great for the environment too. So one thing that opcache cannot do, because everything in PHP always happens on a per file basis, which means that if a file defines a... That's just behind me, I thought the screen went off. When you have a class that you inherit from another class, because PHP handles each class, because they're often in different files, separately, what it still will have to do on every single request is to resolve all the inheritance issues. So it needs to find out whether, if I've overloaded methods, that they implement the same return types, or as we now seen in 7.4, the covariant return types and things like that. It needs to import all the traits if your classes make use of that. And there's a whole bunch of other things that still need to happen on every single request, which isn't great. So PHP 7.4 has a new directive called opcache.preload, which allows you to define a file that gets executed before PHP starts, although it still runs in PHP, where you can define all the classes up front. And by doing that, it means that PHP does no longer need to spend time doing the resolving of all the inheritance and other rules for every request. And that gives you a little bit of a performance benefit as well. Now, how would you use this? As an example, this is an example with Zen Framework, but pretty much it doesn't matter what it does, and this script is trivial if you actually read what it does. So we define a function called preload, and we call it with a specific path to, in this case, the Zen Framework library. Zen Framework is no longer called Zen Framework, but let's skip over that point here. It doesn't matter what it says here. What the preload function does in this case, it takes a directory, loops through all the elements. If it is a normal file, it will call opcache compile file. If it's a directory, it will then recurse into that directory and then try to read any file on that, unless there's a directory, and then it will recurse into that directory. Basically, it's a way of making sure that it preloads every PHP file in this directory that I specified. Once the preloading has done all of this, PHP or opcache itself will then do all this resolving of stuff like that and remembers that information. Now, that does mean that if you change the files on disk, it won't change until PHP is restarted. So you get benefits in performance, but it makes it a little bit harder to deploy because you have to restart PHP or PHP FPM in these cases. Now, tying that back in with FFI, FFI's parsing of C header files, which it needs to do it so that it can translate between PHP and C, is a very, very slow process. But we can now do this in my preloading stage, so it only has to do this once and not for every request again. Now, you need to make one small change to your C header files. It's like you need to define this FFI scope thing, and then you just give it a name. It's just a way of naming basically this API that I have in this header file by a specific name. It doesn't particularly matter what it says, you just need to have a name. Because, of course, after the preloading stage happened, how would I know which functions were preloaded? And you don't know. And the only way how you can access to those functions then is by using this scope. And you'll see that in the example here, like instead of using doing the FFI load with the header file, I'm doing FFI's FFI scope with then the name, and then you can call the methods or the functions on that object there. Each of these features have their issues. Opcache preloading was basically broken before PHP 7.4.3 in many different ways, and it doesn't work on Windows. And I can talk later in a pub about why it doesn't work on Windows, because I don't have another hour. But a combination could be nice. Now, what would I use FFI for? Well, personally, I wouldn't use it for anything. Because you still need to know knowledge of C. And I have that, so I'd rather just write a PHP extension. But there are a few cases when you have an API already available in C, where from a PHP application you might want to use that, but you don't want your users to have to install or compile a PHP extension. And in these cases, you can pretty much make sure that they have the library in C that might already be available in the system through their Linux distribution, for example, or things like that. You'll be able to create an extension that is purely written in PHP, which you then would be able to pull in through Composer. I think it's a niche use case. Opcache preloading, I think, will be useful if you have a largest production environment. If it's just you and your one single server, I probably wouldn't bother with it because the performance gain you get is probably not worth the extra effort that you need to do for having to restart PHP every time you change the file. But that is something that you need to weigh off for yourself. All right. Smaller things are coming up now. PHP up to 7.4 had already two serialization mechanisms. It had the serializable interface, and it had the sleep and wake up magic methods. Both of these things have issues. So instead of fixing that, PHP 7.4 introduces a third method of doing this. Well, the reason why there's a third method and we can't, because if we change any of the other two methods, we end up breaking people's code, and we don't like breaking code. People get angry and shouty at you when you do that, we have found out many times. So pretty much what this now allows you to do is that there's two new magic methods. They're called serialize and unserialize with underscores prepended to it. And these methods are called, when you call serialize and unserialize, and it is up to your implementation of them to return an array where the keys is the name of your properties, or how you want to call them in the array, and their values. So that's what we're doing here. If we have the function serialize, we're returning the temperature property, this one, as t. And then we're restoring this. We're setting the temperature property back from the data argument from the array key t again. That's pretty simple. The whole idea why this is necessary comes into effect when you have inheritance, because sleep and wake up don't really allow you to do anything with inherited properties at all. And the serialized interface has the problem that if you have a serialized string, you can't plug out a specific subpart because it is context dependent on earlier bits in the string, which isn't great. That's this new serialization mechanism solves that. And when you then do this with inheritance, in the serialize of your child class, you first return all the arguments from there, and then you can say in the fire array element, you call parent serialize, which then plugs the array in from the inherited class. And of course, when you unserialize, you need to do that the other way around. So this is quite a little bit more flexible than what serialize does, and definitely what sleep and wake up allow you to do. And if you really want to see the string, then there's all the way in the bottom, but I'll skip over that. PHP 7.3, if you wanted to use the hash or password hash functions, you had to enable that by default. In PHP 7.4, you can't enable or disable it because it's there by default, which I think is a great move. You can always safely use the password hash and password verify methods, which is the only methods you should use for handling passwords in PHP. I know, it's boring. PHP 7.4 also has a few extensions that have been gotten rid of. They go the ways of the dinosaurs, like when the asteroid hit. So I like using emojis. The X recode extension, does anybody remember that one? Any of you used it? No hands? Great, then nobody is going to mind it's gone. It depends on the library that hasn't been seeing update for nearly 20 years. So there we go. XWDDX, any of you have even heard of WDDX? Yeah, I see a few people shaking. This is something that was there to make SOAP easier, but JSON hasn't invented yet, pretty much. But of course, now everybody uses JSON for this kind of location. So This has been moved to Siberia, PECL, which is PHP's extensions and C library repository. We call it Siberia because that's where extensions, not people, extensions go to freeze to death pretty much because they get abandoned. Hence the snowman. Then there's the X-Interbase extension you can use for talking to the Firebird and Interbase extensions. Has been moved to PECL zone. It is a database that not very many people use, but apparently a lot more than we thought. So once the vote came in that, yes, we're going to move this because it's not being maintained, then suddenly a whole bunch of people in Germany showed up saying, oh no, we've been maintaining this for years. But never actually telling anybody else about that, which isn't great. There's a question in the back.
Yeah, I use Firebird a lot.
Excellent.
But I'm using it in PDO, so
right.
It's different.
Yeah, that's a different way. This is just the Interbase extension itself. Okay. So it has been moved to PECL. So in any case, it's not dying any at all because there's an active team actually maintaining it. And by having the extension in PECL, you actually have the additional benefit that you don't have to wait for PHP's release cycle. So you can make modifications and improvements much faster than doing it once per year. So for smaller extension that not everybody has to use, PECL is actually a really good way because it allows developers of these extensions to iterate over it a lot faster anyway. So I would call it a benefit and not a bad thing. That's gone. All right. That would have shown you a screenshot of the PHP internal sales news website, but I'm not hooked up to the Wi-Fi. That's fine, don't worry about it. It's nothing interesting to see there. Except for the list of podcasts that I've done. So I've mentioned a bunch of features now, but what I started doing at the beginning of last year, I started a podcast because I quit my job and I needed to do some fun things. And I started talking to all the people that actually work on improving PHP with a weekly podcast, with a break over Christmas. So every week there's a new episode, and because talking about features in a talk for an hour gets boring, I'm actually talking a little bit about the people behind them as well to at least add some photos of people to it. Anyway, the first episode I spoke with Nikita Popov. Nikita Popov, if you don't know who he is, he pretty much writes 70 to 80% of the new functionality in PHP right now because he's employed by JetBrains, purveyors of nice IDEs, to work on PHP full-time, which is excellent. So episode 1, I spoke to him about scalar number comparisons. PHP has very strange comparisons with numbers, as you sometimes might run into it. However, this didn't make it into PHP 7.4. So PHP 8 maybe? We don't know yet. I spoke with Joe Watkins. He makes interesting extensions. He's the author of the original pthreads extension, and he likes doing that kind of stuff. What he proposed to be added to PHP 7.4 is a weak reference. Now, in PHP, if you say, for example, A equals new object, sorry, I should say new class and then it returns an object, and you do B equals A, then PHP does not copy the object for you, which is good. You don't want it to do that. But PHP does make sure that even if you unset A, the original assignment, it would also not end up freeing the object because B is still pointing to it. This is called reference counting in PHP, which is great. It's a great way of making sure that memory doesn't get freed at the wrong moments and so on and so on. But it does cause some issues. So it's a reasonably common pattern that if you use, for example, things like Doctrine, ODM, or things like that, what these kind of tools, these document mappers want to do is that once it has loaded information in a record from disk, it stores it in an object, and it wants to keep some metadata in there. And it associates this metadata as part of that structure a link to this object, which is great. That's how it works. However, the problem is that if you normally, say, load like 10,000 of these objects from your database, add them to this big list so that the ODM can keep track of what has been changed, even if your application no longer uses these objects, PHP would not free it because there's still this reference to it from this map that links the meta information to these objects, which is not always great, especially if you have thousands of them. So what a weak reference allows you to do is to create a reference to these objects but not prevent PHP's memory manager from being able to clean up this memory. So the way how this works is that in this case we have a ghost class which says boo. I wrote this near Halloween. So we instantiate it, and then with the reference we create a rig reference to this object. So this doesn't bump this internal reference count number in PHP, which allows the which means that PHP can just free up this memory when it needs to do. And the way how you use this from your PHP code is on this rig reference you can call the get method. If the object is still there, it will return the object. If it's not there, it will return null. Which means that the moment it gets end up freed up, then you can't access it anymore. But PHP will be able to free this stuff for you, which I think is kind of a good feature in very specific circumstances. Yeah. Another thing that Nikita added to PHP 7.4 is the short arrow function, or a smaller form of closure, which I think is a nice little addition. But it's only the beginning of this nice little addition, in my opinion. So what this allows you to do is that if we have a traditional closure like this, you have the function keyword that turns into just fn. Then you have a list of arguments, which is the ones that you need to pass in when you call the closure, so the x. And then it says use y, and the y is bound to the scope that defines the closure. And if you don't do that, then there will be no y variable available within the closure. Now, what the short array function allows you to do is to create a very small function that has a single expression. Where we do here return, the result of this fn function is the result of that single expression. Let's have a look at how that looks like. So if you rewrite its traditional closure in a shorter arrow function, you get arrow fn. That's a lot shorter than function. You get the x, because that's the one that we pass in here. And then the arrow, it's arrow function, and then the single expression x plus y. But I think the biggest benefit in here is that you don't have to use this use y anymore. Automatically, it will bind all the variables that are used inside this short arrow function to the outer scope. Now, PHP 7.4 only allows for a single expression here. It is possible to extend this to multiple expressions, where then your only benefit is going to be is that you don't have to explicitly bind variables to the closure scope from outside the closure scope. That's not being decided or discussed on, so that won't likely be in PHP 8, but it might show up later at some point. Okay, and I've just explained all of this, so I'll skip over the slides. The slides are available afterwards if you want to go over this. Yeah, the main use case is for things like filters. Like if you array filter, you have this cumbersome function that you need to call. In PHP 7.4, you can just do that in like a third of the characters. This is probably the best use cases where you would use this. I would not use this everywhere where you can, because that makes it kind of unreadable. All right, we've spoken a little bit about changes to like how the typing system works with return types and things like that. PHP 7.4 fixes a few things on how things get reported. Like in 7.3 and earlier, if you have an interface where the class C implements the interface, but changes the type hint, you get a fatal error. But if you do the normal inheritance, you'd only get a warning, which is inconsistent, and we don't like inconsistencies. So in PHP 7.4, they will, that hasn't made it into PHP 7.4, so maybe PHP 8. A question for you. What is the output of this line?
Code review rejection.
So Rob's seen this talk before, because he's just stolen my joke. He says, code review rejection, and that's the only correct answer. What it actually does output is 4. Yeah, if you want to go through this, you can, but it's bonkers. So PHP 7.4 will now say, this is deprecated. You can't do this without using parentheses around this, which is great because that makes your code actually readable. In PHP 8, it returns, I believe, into a parse error. So you just can't do this anymore, which is great because you really ought not to. What is the output of this script? These two lines. Nobody wants to guess? No?
37, sum:37.
So one more time? I didn't quite.
Sum:37.
Sum:37. No, it returns 7. Why does it return 7? Well, because PHP executes arguments in order. So the first thing it does sum:_.a. That creates a string called sum:3. But then it does plus, which means both sides get converted into a number. And what is the numeric value of sum:3? It's null. So that's where you get 7. PHP 7.4 will tell you, please don't do this. In PHP 8, the change is not going to be a parse error, but rather that the operator precedence changes. And the operator precedence means in which order operations are done. And it will make the plus and the minus, which suffers from the same problem, to a higher precedence than the dot operator, which means they are guaranteed to be run first before it then does the dot, which is what you'd expect to happen, but PHP has never done. Now, we don't like, give me 1 second. We don't like breaking people's code, so we didn't just want to make this change. So what Nikita did, he looked at the top 1,000 projects on GitHub written in PHP, analyzed them, and he found about a dozen situations where people use code like this. Fortunately, there were all bugs, which have now been fixed, hopefully. So we didn't consider this to be a breaking change because it only ends up fixing bugs. That was the question.
Is that just for plus and minus, or also for asterisk and other mathematical operators?
The asterisks and division operators were already at a higher precedence anyway. The only problem was with the dot and the plus and minus, pretty much, yes. Yep. We have now the possibility of being able to throw exceptions into string. You couldn't do that in PHP 7.3, and earlier you get a fatal error explode to string must not throw an exception. The result in PHP 7.4 is you still get a fatal error because we didn't catch the exception. So code in PHP 7.3 and earlier would not suddenly start failing, right? You only have the extra possibility now of returning or throwing exception from toString. On the outside as a PHP user, this seems like a very minor change, like, oh, we're just now allowing throwing exceptions. Internally, that took actually quite a lot of time because there's so many locations where the PHP engine wants to convert an object to a string, and every single of them had to be checked to make sure that it could also deal with exceptions being thrown. So small thing on the outside, quite a big change on the inside. Again, Nikita wrote this bit. This is called Dutton. He made an interesting change to PHP 7.4 as well. Again, Chris, what is the output of this script? Shout it out. You'll get it wrong because it's stupid. There we go. 237. Now, I'll explain you how that happens. Because basically what happens, base converts a number in different bases to a number in another base. So it does, in this case, from base 16, in which you can use the numbers 0 to 9 and the letters A to F. And what PHP does, it pretty much ignores all the other letters and doesn't tell you about this. And hexadecimal ED is 237. PHP 7.4 will tell you this is invalid characters are passed for attempted conversion. These have been ignored. We're not quite sure what PHP 8 is going to do, whether this is going to be a hard error or continuing to be a warning. These two chaps, sorry I couldn't find a photo of Bishop, but Bishop and Theodore, they added another syntax change to PHP, not a functional change, just a syntax change in the parser that allows you to put underscores in numbers. So if you have big numbers that are hard to read, you can now put an underscore in between any of the digits. You can't put them at the end or at the beginning. You can't put it in places such as behind the 0x, because these are not digits, only the 0 starts being a digit. If you want to do pi, then you're going to run out of screen space quite quickly. So yeah, you can use an underscore numbers, and that is only parsing stage. After this has happened, you cannot get that information back. It's purely for making it easier to read. And I think it is mostly useful for when you have to do something with hexadecimal values, where you have a very specific format, or really big numbers like the astronomical unit, the average distance the Earth is away from the sun in meters, stuff like that. Or when you have like bit fields. What you absolutely should never use this for is for phone numbers, because phone numbers aren't numbers, you don't do calculations with them. Or credit card numbers, because you don't do calculations with them. Also, you should never ever hardcode these. And the same holds for social security numbers. That's an American thing because, I mean, in the UK, of course, you have the letters in there too, which you can't do in numbers, clearly. Also, never hardcode these things either. Theodore added another thing, or rather he removed something, and that is now, if you use the curly brace for accessing either array elements or string offsets, you'll now get a warning. 7.3 will do you this. 7.4 will say you cannot do this anymore with curly braces. I'm not sure whether that's been removed in PHP 8 or not, to be fair. But it might go away because it's now deprecated. So please fix that, I guess. And the last one I want to chat about is something that's produced by Matteo. He likes using old-fangled databases with newfangled functionality, like having JSON stored in relational databases. And the way how in SQL you interact with that information is by using the question mark. Basically, that says, give me the value, tell me whether the value foo is in JSON underscore or something. I don't actually know what this operator exactly does. But in PDO, the question mark is a variable substitution. So you can't do this because this will now give you parse error. So how do you solve this? Anyone shout out? You escape it, right? How would you escape that? How would you escape the question mark? A slash, I hear? No, actually you do that by duplicating the character. Now that looks a bit weird. It turns into question mark, which is not what you'd expect for PHP escaping, but this is how SQL does escaping. It is a very common pattern in there. So now you can use your fancy JSON data operators with PDO, but you have used question mark to escape your question mark operator, which I think is kind of neat. Some of those people had never contributed any patches to PHP. They start out with something simple. That is why most of these things are actually kind of smaller things. But we encourage people to do smaller things instead of, oh, let's rewrite everything, or things like that, because it's hard to do. It's also really hard to convince other people to go vote for your feature. So step by step is the best approach to get things in. Since then, I've started doing the second season of the podcast, which you can listen to. There's a new episode every Thursday. We also removed a whole bunch of stuff in PHP 7.4. Removed it or deprecated it. None of this is likely you're ever going to run into. With the exception of perhaps array key exists with objects, because some people have been using array key exist like a property exists with objects, because you could. Some old code will potentially use that. Other than that, I have not used any of these ever, I think. In any case, if you do, you can't use them anymore, or you need to start changing your code pretty much. This list is much better explained in PHP's changelog, but I didn't want to go through all of them because that gets boring pretty quickly. All right. Any questions or queries? Yes.
Serialize.
Yes.
If you've got a long object chain, does every object in that chain have to call serialize, or can you have essentially a non-primitive somewhere in there?
If you don't call the parent, then the parent's properties won't be in a serialized string.
So I'm thinking if you've got a person that has many, I don't know, a class that's got many people and people have an address, so you've got your objects like that. If you call serialized on a class, does that mean every person object in there also has to be serialized, or could you?
Yes. You're going to be responsible for each class what needs to be serialized from it. And it won't, if you don't do it, it will default to an empty array, I believe. So yes, you are responsible for doing all of them yourself. So if you have a class that has an array of objects, you're going to have to potentially have to call each of these objects serialize yourself, yes. Yep. Anything else? Yes, go ahead.
Am I correct that there is no workaround for having to declare strict in every single place if you want to avoid your old dependencies from breaking?
Correct. There's no change to what PHP does, whether a file is in strict type mode or weak type mode. This is something we're currently talking about for PHP 8, but we haven't quite figured out the full result of that discussion, so we don't quite know yet what is happening there. But right now, this isn't changed in 7.4 because it's not really things you can change in just a minor version. It is potentially something that we can change for 8, but I would say that is a slim chance that it happens. All right, so there was one in the back there, so. Hiya. Can you speak up? I can't hear.
Yeah, sorry. I was using PHP when it was in version 5.1 and 5.2, and at the time it felt like there was a long time between releases, and 5.3 was the first time where there was a lot of energy. Could you talk a little bit about why that was, or what was the reason for the language nearly dying and then coming back to life?
Okay, the answer is on my t-shirt, actually. This wasn't a planted question, by the way. No, after PHP 5.2 was out, we started doing a lot of effort on adding an additional type to PHP, which is a Unicode string with Unicode string semantics. That took a lot of effort, and in the end, we decided not to go ahead with it because of the big increases in memory usage and decreased performance. Once that realization was made, all the features that were put into 6 were being backported to PHP 5, and that turned into PHP 5.3. And since then, because we then started focusing on more small additions, the 5.4, 5.5, 5.6, 7.0, and so on were released much more frequently. And currently, the release cadence is once a year. Every year, end of November, start of December, give or take a week, will be a new version of PHP. So I can pretty much guarantee it that PHP 8 will be out the last Thursday in November or the first Thursday in December. So we have a very set cadence. Feature freeze happens somewhere in July. Set schedules for release candidates, and nothing is ad hoc anymore. Bug fix releases of PHP are every 4 weeks. So yeah, we have changed that from being ad hoc releases to being a very set schedule since about PHP 5.6, and I think that is actually really useful to have, and hopefully you agree with that.
And there's still the involvement of Facebook. Did that help as well in terms of
the involvement of Facebook didn't really change much there. The only thing that did after Hack came out, well, PHP 5.3 was out, is that it made us look really good at how to be able to optimize PHP itself. But our first intention is we need to get a JIT engine in PHP. That back then was a fruitless effort. But when doing the research for it, we found out that there's so much things we can optimize memory-wise, and that turned into PHP 7, which was on par performance again with 8HVM, or then called hip hop, or whatever name that was in effect at the time. So it didn't really change much to the frequency or the features added to PHP, but more to let's look at our engine really well and see whether we can increase the performance. And since 7, performance has been increasing about 20 to 30%, not 20 to 30 times, because that'd be amazing every release. And now for PHP 8, which is the upcoming release, we're looking, or there is a JIT engine in there again, but whether that makes sense or not, we're not quite sure, or well, I'm not quite sure, let me put it that way. Right, anything else? Yeah?
Do you have any idea when generics will come?
The question is, do you have any ideas when generics will come? No. Generics seems like a simple addition. It is really, really hard to do in PHP. Because I mentioned before that everything in PHP happens per single file. And doing that with generics makes that really, really hard to do. Now, there's also cases, what syntax do you use? That is hard in PHP because, as I mentioned with the question mark equals, we're running out of symbols and we don't really want to use snowmans. Although it would be better for my slides. But, so it's really, really hard. Some research has happened in generics. Nikita has been writing prototypes for it. But so far, he's not wanted to talk to me about that at all. Not to me at all, or for the podcast. So I'll keep wringing his arm to see whether that happens at some point. But I think the chance is low that it will be in PHP 8.0. Yeah. It would be nice to have, I agree, but it's not a trivial thing to add.
8.1 then.
8.1, yeah. Next year, 2021. Excellent. Okay, I'm run out of time. So thank you very much. I think we have a little bit of a break.
Yeah.
There's some pizza left, I can see, if you want. And
5-minute break.
5-minute break. Excellent.
We'll see you back, and please fill out
Oh,
again.
hang on. I have my own QR code. There we go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. See you in
Thanks.
5 minutes.